Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what I call inquisitive poker. Now, I've done a lot of seminars, a lot of teaching over the course of the last few years. Walking down the hall here at the World Series of Poker at the Rio, I get questions all the time, stuff like, so I've got ace-queen in early position, I raise and get one caller, and the flop comes jack 6-4. And inevitably, my student will ask me something like, what would you do? Good question, what would I do? Another typical example, I've got pocket jacks in middle position and I hate pocket jacks, right? How would you play it? These are the kinds of questions that typical students, typical beginning poker players will ask. And what they are looking for is a prescription. They want me to prescribe a correct way to play a hand. They're not thinking about the game the right way. Another example, a couple of days ago, I flopped a set of sevens. He slow played it, and his opponent caught a runner-runner flush. Did he do the right thing? Now, I mean, people are laughing in the audience right now, but I guarantee you, you've asked similar questions. And the interesting thing about these questions is that none of them have answers. And good instructors, good poker players, or good instructors will never answer those questions. I'm not going to answer, how would you play it? I'm not going to answer, what would you do? Those are not questions that I'm going to answer. And the most important thing that I can try to convince you today is that good students will never ask those questions. Okay? So what I'm going to try to do in the next 30, 40 minutes or so is try to get you to think about poker not in a prescriptive way, not where I just tell you how to play your hand, right? And just keep walking. Yeah, raise with those two jacks. Well, bet half the pot and see if he calls with the ace-queen. Or no, you screwed it up when you slow played, you moron, right? That's the answer that I give if I got to go to my car, right? If I'm on my way out and I really don't want to deal with you. That's not helping you by answering questions that way. The right way to approach this is to think about the two types of players. The people that want those questions answered in a one-word sentence, or in one sentence, those are people looking for a prescription. They are predictable. They're formulaic, right? They're tight, they're nitty, and they're not getting any better. The type of player that you want to be is inquisitive. That's the type of player that I want you to be. Inquisitive players are unpredictable. You might say an inquisitive player is a feel player. You never know what type of style they're going to play. They're aggressive, they're intuitive, and most importantly, they're always getting better. Okay? So if you're the type of person that might ask me, how would you play ace-queen from middle position? My theory is that you are looking for a prescription, and instead of that, I'm going to try to get you to be more inquisitive. Okay? So the only question that you need to ask is, what questions should I be asking myself? That's the only question that you really need to ask. Let's talk about that. What I'm trying to do here is create a mindset for poker players to be more scientific. Now, you may not know, but before I became a professional poker player, I was a computer scientist and computer programmer. I went to Georgia Tech. So science is in my genes, and I like to think about the game in this scientific way. A scientific way would start with, it's your turn to act. You ask yourself lots of questions, right? You develop a hypothesis about what the correct play is, and you put it into action. And then you analyze your results, you revise your questions, and then what do you know? It's your turn to act again. That's the great thing about this game is that you get to see the results of your actions in 1 minute, and shortly thereafter, you get to do it again and again and again and again and again, hundreds of thousands of times a year if you're a true degenerate. Right? And you just keep getting better and better. And as this scientific method progresses, the questions that you ask yourself in certain situations will become better. And you'll give some of them more importance. And pretty soon, you'll be able to just synthesize the entire state of the table very quickly, figure out what questions are the most important in this situation, answer those questions more accurately than you currently do, and your results are going to get tremendously better very quickly. Okay? So let's talk about some of those questions. Let's talk about being the first person to enter the pot in No Limit Hold'em. Okay? Some of the questions that I like to ask myself. How likely is it that I have the best hand? Okay? So this is central. If you're going to put chips into the pot, you kind of want to be ahead. That's why you don't play the Jack 5 suited from under the gun in No Limit Hold'em unless you're Gus Hansen. Right? You really kind of want to have the best hand. You don't want to be putting your chips into the pot already behind. Right? So one of the first questions you ask yourself is, how likely is this to be the best hand? The second question that I like to ask, how often do the small and the big blind defend? This is one of the most important things and one of the biggest changes that I've made to my game recently. I used to think about, okay, from very early position, I play pretty tight. I'm going to play nines or better, ace, king, ace, queen, and from under the gun. And then I'm going to play a few more hands, 8, 7s, ace, jack suited from the next position. And I kept thinking about the table and getting progressively looser as my position moved around the table. And then a big switch happened. I was talking to Mark Voss at a poker tournament in Europe a couple of years ago, and Mark said, Phil, what are you doing, playing this prescriptive way? You need to start looking at the guys that are in the small and the big blind. Those are the guys that are most important. It doesn't really matter the quality of your hand so much as the quality of the opponents in the small and the big blind. And that really made a big impact on me, because what I realized is that if those players are particularly weak, and they can be weak in a number of ways. They can either play too many hands and play them weak and passive, or they can just fold too much. I prefer the guys that fold too much. But if they fold too much, or they play a particularly weak style, that's the time to get involved with the pot, kind of almost regardless of what hand you have. Right? So this is a really important question to ask yourself if you're thinking about playing a hand. How well do the players in the small and the big blind play? Another question you can ask yourself is, how many hands have I played recently? Right? If you've played three or four hands out of the last 5, people are going to get a little sick and tired of you raising, and you can expect to get pushed back. Right? Even if you had aces and kings and aces 3 hands in a row, your opponents probably don't know that. They just think that you're just starting to be a bully, and the next hand you pick up 2 6s. And you're like, well, I'm supposed to raise with this hand. But if you ask yourself this question, you might come to the conclusion that 6s are kind of marginal in this spot anyway. Maybe I'll just fold because I think my opponents are going to come back over the top and force me to fold this hand because I've played so many hands recently, right? What hands will my opponent expect me to be playing? Another great question to ask yourself, right? Your opponents, most thinking opponents, are trying to put you on a hand. Think about that. What am I going to do if I get 3-bet or re-raised? This is a very, very important question. And One of the interesting things here is that most most great players that I know have a plan. And that plan is going to be, well, if I raise and this guy re-raises, I know what I'm going to do. If this guy re-raises, I know what I'm going to do. If this guy re-raises, I know what I'm going to do. They're always thinking one step ahead, right? And I think it's really important to know what you're going to do, to know what your plan is, and to be able to pull the trigger on that plan if you do get re-raised, right? But think about what's going to happen if you open the pot and you raise it 3 times the big blind. What are you going to do if the guy on the button 3-bets you? If you don't know the answer to that question, then you should probably be thinking about that question a little bit more before you just decide to open the pot. How have any of the remaining players given anything away? One of the things that you can do today, who's playing in the tournament today? Or this weekend sometime? Yeah? A lot of you. Wow, great. Watch the player in the small and the big blind, okay? My advice to you is don't look at your hand until it's your turn to bet, okay? You're not going to give anything away. So I almost never look at my cards until it's actually my turn, okay? But I am watching very carefully the guys in the small and the big blind. And it's amazing how incredibly obvious they make their intention, okay? If the guy in the big blind, it looks at his hand and he's got 7-2, and you're watching him look at his hand, a lot of times the guys will just pick the cards up and just look like they're going to fold, right? Or if they look down and they've got ace-king or 2 kings, man, they're watching the action like a hawk, right? I mean, it is incredibly obvious that they plan on playing the hand. And my advice is that the guy that's in the big blind, the small and the big blinds, those are the most important guys for you to be watching for this kind of tell. And I promise you, if you're not used to looking at this, looking for this, you can make so much easy money and save yourself so much money by not attempting to steal when they have a good hand and attempting to steal when they're planning on folding, okay? So watch those guys in the small and the big blind today. And don't look at your hand until it's your turn to bet, particularly if you're in the big blind, right? If you don't know what you have in the big blind, I can't know what you have. And that's good for you, right? It'll force you to pay attention to the action more. It'll keep you focused, and you're not going to give anything away. But I can promise you in these small fields, or in these small buy-in events here at the World Series of Poker, and yes, $1,000 is a small buy-in, yeah. But in these small buy-in events, there are a lot of amateur players who will give this information away to you freely. And it's your job as a poker player to pick up on it, okay? That's the tell that I really want you to look for today. Look for the people that are looking at their cards in the blinds early and then giving away their intention. It will be incredibly obvious to you, okay? How many players do I want to play this hand against? A lot of hands play better in multi-way pots. A lot of hands play better heads up, right? This is an important question to ask yourself. Again, if you ask me how to play ace-queen, these are the questions, if we have 15 minutes to talk about the hand, these are the questions that I'm going to ask you to answer. I'm not going to say, oh, you just raise it, right? But I'm going to ask you these questions, and then we're going to come up with a hypothesis. Does this make any sense? I hope so. Another key, what are the remaining stack sizes? You need to know within 1 or 2 blinds every stack size at the table, particularly for the guys that are acting behind you, right? If someone's acting in front of you, okay, you can figure that out after they raise. But for the stacks that are behind you, it's really important that you keep track of their stack sizes. Why is this important? Well, it's important because if they're short stacked and you raise 3 times the blind and they move in for 10 times the blind, you kind of have to call, right? You're getting 2 to 1 on your money. Folding is almost always a mistake. And from a mathematical perspective, you're going to have to call. So you really want to be sure that you know what their stack sizes are at every opportunity. Okay? And this leads to one of the other questions. Does getting involved in the hand get me pot committed? And if the answer to that question is yes, that's an important thing to know, right? If you're going to have to go with your hand regardless, then it's really important that you answer this question. Playing this hand basically means that you're going to get it all in. And what are the chances of flopping a great hand, right? So this is just kind of basic math, but if you have unpaired cards, like ace king, ace queen, king queen, something like that, okay? If you have any unpaired cards, you're only going to flop a pair about 1 out of 3 times. Okay? And you know this intuitively, because even if you don't know the math, because you know every time you get ace king, right? Ace king's such a great hand, everyone loves it, and you raise, you get that sinking feeling in your stomach before the flop comes down, right? Because you know how hard it is to flop an ace or a king when you have ace king. You're only going to flop a pair 1 out of 3 times. That means 2 out of 3 times you're going to flop dog shit. Beep. Yeah, so you know this intuitively. If you have a pair, you're going to flop a set maybe 1 out of 8 times, okay? If you have a flush, or if you have like 2 cards of the same suit, I think a lot of people in this room probably suffer from a disease that I call suititis. You love playing the suited cards. The ace-5 of diamonds, oh my God, you could never possibly fold the ace-5 of diamonds. Right? How can you fold the ace-5 of diamonds? You got suititis back there? No? Okay. Yeah, you got suititis? Yeah. Jack-9 of clubs, oh my God, they're suited. I can flop a flush. Can't wait to play those suited cards. When I was hosting Celebrity Poker Showdown, if it was like 90% that if the person was suited, they were playing their hand. Yeah, they just couldn't help themselves. In reality, flopping a flush is a lot less likely than probably you think. You're only going to flop a flush 0.84% of the time. 1 out of 120 times that you're suited, okay? So if you have the ace-5 of diamonds, it's going to come diamond, diamond, diamond 1 out of 120 times. It's just incredibly unlikely. And even when you do flop the flush, you normally don't really even get paid, right? So just don't overvalue being suited so much. The ranks of your cards are much, much more important than the suits. Okay, so question that you ask yourself pre-flop are, what are the chances of flopping a great hand? Okay, so again, we are trying to implement the scientific method for poker. We're thinking about these questions, we're developing a hypothesis, we're going to test them, we're going to analyze our results, and then we're going to try to ask ourselves better questions the next time we get into the same situation. If you're thinking about stealing, right? If you're thinking about going for trying to steal the blinds, again, one of the most important questions to ask yourself is, how frequently do the big and small blind defend? What hands are they going to defend with? And are any of the remaining players tremendously desperate or very short-stacked? I see a lot of people make the mistake of trying to steal the blinds from a guy who has 4 big blinds left. Like, they're going to call you. They're going to call you. And if you have 7-5 and you raise it trying to steal their blinds, you're going to get called. You're not stealing their blinds, you're just giving them a free chance to double up. Okay? If you raise in a short stack shoves, are you going to be pot committed? Again, this is back to that 10 times a big blind, 15 times a big blind. If you raise and someone with 10 times a big blind moves it in, you're going to have to call, right? So you got to think about these kind of things, especially in these small buy-in tournaments where the average stack size is around 20, 25 times a big blind. In these 1K events, it almost always degenerates after day one or late in day one where the average stack is 25 times a blind. You made day two of the ladies event, and the average stack right now is what? 22 blinds. It happens that way every single time. So think about it. If the average stack is 22 blinds, right, and you get yourself into a spot where you have to call, not liking it, 10 blinds, you're basically blowing off half an average stack in a spot where you don't really need to be doing it, okay? So it's very, very important to think about the stack sizes of the remaining players, and if you're going to be pot committed against their shove. Okay? Another great question to ask yourself is, are there any extra motivations for your opponents to be folding? Are they going to be playing tighter than normal? Right? And in my experience, I see people playing tighter than normal near the bubble. Right? That's a time where it's very important to get aggressive. You can steal chips if people are trying to sneak into the money. Near the end of a session, right? People have been playing 10 hours, 8 hours, and they're tired. They're tired. Your goal is to win every last pot before the break. Okay? I want you to really try that today. Don't even look at your cards, okay? The last hand before the break, you're going to play that hand, you're going to raise it, and you are going to win that pot. I can tell you it's remarkable how tight people play the last hand before the break. They are anxious to get on their phone and call their spouse. They need to go to the bathroom. They want to go get a soda at the canteen. They want to come by the Bad Beat on Cancer booth and pick up some of the nuts that are in front of you, right? They want to do everything but play that hand. I've seen some crazy, crazy folds from tight players because they want to just get to that next break, or they want to get to day two, or they want to get in the money. A couple of years ago at the World Series in one of these 1K events, we were near the bubble, and I was just completely running over the table. I'd won like 14 pots in a row because we were on the bubble, and I knew everyone at my table wanted to cash, and I'm under the gun, and I'm honestly feeling guilty. But I raised again. I raised again. I was feeling kind of bad about it, but I raised again. And just as I raised, I heard the tournament director off in the distance say, "One more player to go before the bubble breaks." And I'm like, yes. Everyone's going to fold again. Like, perfect timing. Couldn't have been better, right? Everyone folds around, and the guy in the big blind, who has like 40 big blinds, I've doubled the blind. Just min raise under the gun for the 15th hand in a row. The guy in the big blind says, "I'm not going to go broke on the bubble to you." And he folds 2 kings face up. I'm telling you, people do crazy stuff. Maybe I had him hypnotized. I'm not sure. But people do crazy, crazy things. The bubble burst, and of course, by that time, I had everyone's chips. I think I tripled up on the bubble, like just stealing blinds and antes. 15 hands in a row I won. It was crazy. But it's harder to get away with that stuff now. But the point is, people have motivations that you might need to analyze and think about. And if you ask yourself this question, right, you can often find some spots where it looks normal to fold, but answering this question and giving it relatively more importance than the strength of your actual hand will lead you to a better conclusion and lead you to a different play than you might make otherwise. Okay? Another thing that you might look for here that's extra motivation to fold is if someone's spouse comes and is like looking at them and like, waving them over, right? If they're in the blind, raise it, right? I mean, they're not going to play their hand. They just got called, right? Another question you might want to ask yourself is, can you afford to raise and then give up? Right? Sometimes, even raising 3 times a blind or 4 times a blind and then having to fold will put your stack in a very vulnerable spot, right? So for instance, if I have 10 or 11 times the blind, I don't want to raise 3 times the blind and then get myself into a spot after the flop. It's just, I want to see all the cards. So I can't afford to raise 3 times the blind most of the time and then give up. I'm going to have to go with it. So if I'm going to have to go with it, I might as well go with it right now and apply maximum pressure and move it in. That's one of the reasons that I think that if you have 10 times the blind or less, okay, my advice is if you're going to play your hand, go all in. If you have 10 times the blind or less and you're going to play it, just ship it. Okay, and that serves me pretty well from a short stack perspective. But you don't want to get yourself into a spot where you raise pre-flop and then have to give up. If you're going to call a raise, someone raises and you're thinking about calling, right? Here's some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself. What type of hands does my opponent play, right? It's very important that you think about the quality of your opponent's hands and their tendencies. If everyone folds and a guy in late position raises, I'm thinking, okay, that guy, I've seen him play Jack-8 suited from that spot in the same position. So he's playing all his suited kings, he's playing most of his suited queens, he's playing 35–40% of his hands, right? So it's important to think about the types of hands that your opponents play from each position. How does my hand play against those hands, right? Am I playing a dominated hand or am I playing a dominating hand? Is my hand better than the average hand that my opponent will have? Very important, right? And this is also very important, especially in these short stack tournaments. If I call, how likely is it that I'm going to get squeezed? And by squeezed, I mean someone raises 3 times the blind and you call, and then someone else that's yet to act makes a big re-raise. This is something that you're going to see a lot, and it's a very, very effective play. People know that you don't have that great a hand when you just call that opening raise, and so they're very likely, if they're aggressive players, to try to win the six or 7 blinds plus antes that are in the pot, and they're going to try to squeeze you out of it. So just looking around and saying, oh, well, that guy, he likes to squeeze a lot, so I don't think I can call, right? If there are a bunch of 10, 12, 15 times a blind stacks left to act behind me, and my opponent opens, I'm never going to call in that spot, okay? Because I'm just so worried that my 3 short stacked opponents are going to move in. And now I'm going to be in a really, really tough spot, all right? So it's very important, once again, to think about the stack sizes that are remaining around the table and think about what will happen if you get squeezed, right? When I brought up the ace-queen example earlier, right? And a guy says, someone opened and what should I do with my ace-queen? Well, this is one of the questions that's really important. Sometimes you should call with that ace-queen, sometimes you should re-raise, and sometimes you should fold. It's all going to depend on the answers to these questions. If there are a lot of short stack players that are left to act that are very aggressive, I might call knowing that one of them is going to squeeze, and now I get a chance to call their squeeze raise, right? If you call, what range of hands will your opponent put you on? You don't want to play your hand face up, right? If you can help it, you want to keep your opponent guessing by applying pressure. A lot of times it's so easy to read, especially novice opponents. If I raise from middle position and you call on the button, I'm going to have a really strong idea of what you have, okay? If you're a novice player playing against me, I know, for instance, that novice players don't ever make this play with 2 aces or 2 kings or 2 queens. They almost always re-raise, okay? I know you don't have ace-king because you probably would have re-raised, right? I'm pretty sure that you play your small pairs your deuces through nines. You're going to call with those hands. You're probably going to be calling me with ace-jack, king-queen suited, ace-queen sometimes. You might re-raise with ace-queen, but because you're scared of me, you probably won't. You'll probably just try to flop an ace or a queen, right? So I can narrow your hand range a lot, right? And it's important to ask yourself, if you call, what will my opponent know about my hand? Am I going to be is my range going to be so tight that I'm going to be easy to play against? Okay, and if you think that you're going to be easy to play against, then you need to change the way you're playing your game, right? You need to start re-raising more. You need to start mixing it up a little bit more. You need to throw in a couple of weird hand combinations just to make yourself more unpredictable and less likely to get outplayed, especially against quality opponents. So as I mentioned, post-flop, the questions you ask yourself are almost always about range. And what range of hands does my opponent have, and what range of hands does my opponent think that I have? So let me give you an example. Here, a player under the gun raises 3 times a blind. He's a tight player, right? Let's think about his range. His range is probably 9s, 10s, jacks, queen, kings, aces, ace, king, ace, queen suited, ace, jack suited. I think a tight player under the gun's folding ace, 10 suited. And doing so correctly, by the way, okay? So that's the range of hands that I'm putting him on. It goes fold, 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 fold. And I call. What range of hands does my opponent think that I'm going to be playing? Another question that you have to answer all the time. These are the two important questions post-flop. Every hand, you have to answer these 2 questions. If you're not answering these 2 questions post-flop, then you basically are playing the game at what we call level 1, okay? All you're thinking about is your hand and how your hand interacts with the board, okay? I want you to start thinking more on level 2, level 3, which is, what do I have, what does my opponent have, and what does my opponent think that I have? Right? Now you're starting to play the game. Now you're starting to play poker. Just looking down at your ace-queen and seeing that there's not an ace or a queen on the flop, oh well, that's not poker, I don't know what game that is. That's a losing game, okay? So start thinking about what range of hands your opponent has, what range of hands your opponent thinks that you have. Another good example. We're playing against Dan Harrington in the big blind, okay? We raise 3 times the blind from middle position, and Dan calls. Okay? Everyone knows Dan Harrington's a pretty tight player. At least that's the image that he likes to portray. Still a little unsure if he's snowing us all, but if he is, he's been running that same snow for about 25 years. Okay? Dan calls from the big blind. I want everyone here to think, just for a second, what hands do they think that Dan Harrington would call this raise with? Okay? I think he's going to call with. Do you have an answer?
King Jack suited or better.
King Jack suited, okay. Pocket pairs, he calls with pocket pairs. You know, would he re-raise with aces? Yeah, he probably would. He'd re-raise with kings. He's tight. I mean, it depends on our image too, right? If we've been playing a lot of hands, another question, how many hands have we been playing? If we've been playing a lot of hands, he's going to defend more aggressively. If we're a very tight player, he's going to defend tighter, right? So a lot's going to depend on what Dan thinks that we have, right? A lot's going to depend on the stack sizes too. If we have 150 blinds each, and we're playing in a cash game, Dan might defend with 6-5 suited or 6-4 suited, trying to flop something good. If we're playing 30 blinds deep in a tournament near the bubble, Dan's not calling with 6-5 suited, I can promise you. Okay? Does that make any sense? So you ask yourself these questions, you revise your hypothesis, you try to dig deep. You're right? And you're trying to put him on a range of hands, not a specific hand. I see a lot of amateur players think, oh, he's got Jack 10. If you're that good and you can put him on Jack 10, okay, you know, I needed to be taking lessons from you, right? Don't put him on a single hand, put him on a range of hands. And then compare that range with the flop and see how that interacts, all right? Same example, except for now we're playing against Gus Hansen, all right? And we raise 3 times the blind from the same position and everyone folds and Gus calls. What does that mean? That means that Gus is still alive. Sorry? He didn't. His phone rang and he decided not to 3-bet. I don't know, but it means he's still alive. Everyone knows that Gus plays a lot different style than Dan Harrington, right? If you haven't read Gus's book, by the way, it's amazing. I can't remember the name. Every Hand Revealed. Yeah, it's an amazingly great book. I strongly suggest it. And then I strongly suggest that you forget everything that he tries to teach you in the book, almost immediately thereafter. He's an amazing tournament player, but he has some strange ways of doing things. So Gus calls, and what's interesting is that when I compared Dan Harrington and then said Gus called, everyone in the room laughed. So they're so different, right? And intuitively, you know that the call from Dan Harrington means something entirely different than the call from Gus. But I don't know how many of you would be willing to put the work in at the table to think about the range of hands that Gus is going to call with and the range that Dan Harrington is going to call with and how different that makes the hand play out after the flop. Right? The only thing that you really know if Gus calls is that he probably doesn't have 7-2 offsuit. And he might. Okay? It might be, he said, yeah, it's in his range. Right? I mean, that's basically basically all you know. And he probably doesn't have aces because he would have re-raised. Okay? So, again, it's all about range post-flop. If you're trying to answer the question in your head, what range of hands does my opponent think that I have? Remember that most opponents have fairly short-term memories, all right? If you are loose, if they think that you're loose and you're playing a lot of hands, they're going to give less respect to your raise, or to your hand. They're going to think that your hand has a much wider range than it probably does. Okay? If you're tight, if they think that you're a tight player, they're going to narrow your range considerably, okay, and probably try to put you in a tight box. Whether or not you deserve to be there is a separate story. But you need to know what your image is, and you need to think about what your opponents think about your hand, right? Remember, good thinking opponents are trying to put you on this range of hands. If you're the type of player who is extremely patient, and you've been folding, and suddenly you play a hand, your opponents are going to put you on aces or kings or queens or ace-king, right? Right? You'd be crazy not to. Well, if they're going to put you on that strong a hand, then maybe you should be playing 7-4. Right? Does that make any sense? Right. You should be playing 7-4 and play it like it's aces. It's incredible to me when I see very, very tight players not take advantage of the incredible image that they have at the table. If you are one of those players that plays a very tight game, and tight is right. I'm not denigrating tight. I think tight is right. Tight is a great way to play. A tight, aggressive style is a winning style at poker, okay? If you have a tight, aggressive image, and you haven't played a hand in an hour, I almost don't care what your next hand is. Play it, and play it strong. You can win the pot. You can play 7-4 just like it's aces. But I don't see a lot of people that are willing to play 7-4 like it's aces, even if they have the image that will make that a successful play. And I don't understand it. Your image is everything, okay? Take advantage of it. If you're a tight player and your opponents are thinking players, you can win a lot of pots very quickly and very easily without confrontation. Against novice opponents are not thinking about your hand. Novice opponents only think about their hand and how their hand interacts with the board. And one of the mistakes that I make, it's my biggest weakness at the table, is trying to bluff people who can't fold. Okay? Trying to bluff people who won't fold is a huge, huge problem in weak fields. You don't win poker tournaments in weak fields by getting bad players to fold good hands. They do not fold. If they have ace-10 and the board is ace-7-4 on the flop, there is no amount of money that you can bet that they will fold. Okay? And you can try all you want to try to represent ace-king or ace-queen or ace-jack or two-pair or a set. You can try all day long to represent a hand. But what I need to try to convince you is they are not paying any attention to what you're trying to represent. All they know is they've got an ace and there's an ace on the board. Okay? Do not try to bluff bad players. Okay? They will call you, I promise you. Yes, question?
The good news is they pay off too.
Yes. Yeah, right. You're right. The good news is they pay you off. When you actually have the best hand, you are going to win all of their chips. But you are not going to win all of their chips by bluffing them off top pair. I can promise you. And I like to emphasize this because it is my biggest weakness at the table, especially going to play in tournaments like today, the 1Ks. It's astounding to me how I keep making the same mistake over and over and over. Okay, I've got just a few more. In summary, I want you to ask yourself the right questions. The answers to the questions that you come up with are less important, actually, than just asking yourself those questions. Okay? Over time, you're going to revise the questions that you ask yourself using the scientific method. You're going to apply more importance to some questions than others, and you're going to get better. That's the whole thing. You're going to be an inquisitive player, not a prescriptive player. Don't ever ask someone how they should play ace-queen from middle position, right? Think about the questions that I've tried to convince you are the questions to ask. The only question you need to ask yourself, or to ask a better player, is what question should I be asking myself in this spot? Okay? And if you can get to a point where you can do that, I promise you your results are going to improve and improve very quickly.